Hello folks, Scott here with the new Hero Studio card kit of the month for September of 2025. Our Hero Studio theme for September is Fall in the Forests. The Hero Studio card kit starts with the Fall is My Favorite 6x8" stamp set featuring all of these squirrels. What is that? 5, a number of pumpkins, fall leaves, acorns, mushrooms. There's a little cup of coffee there, a book, a bigger mushroom, looks like a carved heart. There is a little stump over here. Thankful for you, fall is my favorite color. You got this. Hello. That is our stamp set. We of course get coordinating dies that go along with this, and it doesn't look like we have any sentiment dies in that. Not a surprise considering the new metal tariffs that have gone into effect. Then we also have the Treehouse die set, which cuts out a big tree here, and you can obviously put a big hole in the middle of your tree or just carve a heart, you and me, I heart you, and a little arrow. That's the Treehouse die set. Then we get sunset enamel dots, a pack of sunset enamel dots. Those are great colors. A nice yellow, kind of an ochre orange, and a red. And brown twine. I'm not quite sure if this is exactly the same twine as you guys get. I didn't get twine with my pack, but I do, of course, have twine in my stash. So you get a yard of brown twine. And we also get cardstock this month. We have 10 sheets of 8.5 by 5.5 inch cardstocks. That comes in truffle, merlot, cinnamon, terracotta, carrot, coral. This one's coral, bellini, beeswax, saffron, and Tuscan, and 10 pieces of cardstock. I believe those are the right names for those colors there. The Fall in the Forest, September Hero Studio. This is the card kit of the month. I guess I'll be getting familiar with some squirrels. And here we have our 10 cards from the Hero Studio card kit of the month. Fall in the Forest. This kit is perfect for all of your fall or autumnal needs. Now, there's not a lot of sentiments this month, but that just gives me more room to come up with a few classic chestnuts, no pun intended, and maybe some new sentiments as well. Now, it may be the simple juxtaposition of that sleeping squirrel and the big pumpkin on the stamp set, but that made me think of this, and we have happy autumn. Let's get cozy with our sleeping squirrel on top of that pumpkin, on top of the leaves, on a panel of 80-pound Nina Solar White cardstock. I stamped the squirrel with VersaFine Onyx black ink, and I stamped the same on a piece of masking paper. Now, I fussy cut the bottom of the squirrel masking and placed that over the stamped squirrel, and then I stamped the pumpkin with VersaFine Onyx black ink. I also stamped the same pumpkin on more masking paper, and I fussy cut the bottom edge, placed that over the pumpkin, and then stamped the pile of leaves at the bottom. That gives us, blink, blink, a perfectly stamped little vignette. I decided this would be a great kit to practice coloring with my Hoo-Hoo alcohol markers. All of the colored images this month, except for the small individual leaves, were colored with this batch of Hoo-Hoo alcohol markers. It's quite the autumnal palette. Now, I did do some partial die cutting to cut this vignette out. I die cut the top half of the squirrel by putting my top cutting plate where it meets the pumpkin. So I just die cut the top half of the squirrel, and then I flipped it around and I die cut the bottom half of the leaves, again stopping my cutting plate right where it met the pumpkin. So that die cut the top and bottom, and then I just fussy cut the sides of the pumpkin to join the two partial die cuts. That makes it look like there was a special die just made for this combination. And you don't have to worry about extraneous white borders on your die cuts. I do love that. Now, I didn't think any of the kit sentiments were particularly appropriate for this little scene, so I dug through my old My Monthly Hero kits. I found these two sentiments in the My Monthly Hero September 2023. There's that Happy Autumn stamp right there. And I found the Let's Get Cozy in the My Monthly Hero September 2020 kit. That's it right there. Let's Get Cozy. Even though these sentiments are from two different My Monthly Hero kits, I think they work quite well together. I stamped both of the sentiments on white cardstock with VersaFine Onyx Black ink and embossed them with clear embossing powder. Get a little shine there. I die cut both with a Lawn Fawn Everyday Sentiment Banners die. Now, fortunately, I had stamped our vignette right in the center of a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white panel. And with the partial die cutting and fussy cutting, I had a perfectly shaped hole in the center of an A2 panel. So I trimmed that panel to 3 1/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, keeping the die cut opening in the center. And I embossed it with a Tailored Expressions burlap embossing folder. That kind of kills the stitching on the edges, but I love that texture. I did ink the top raised side of the embossing folder with antique linen distress oxide ink, which then gives us some color on the inside of the depressions. And I also ink blended a little more of the same ink around the edges. That texture feels really cozy too. I added a thin black mat behind the embossed panel, filling in the center opening as well, and glued that to an A2 white card base. I added the sentiments and the vignette to the card front with thin foam tape. Now, when viewed at an angle, you get a perfectly shaped black shadow right under the cut vignette. It's not quite an eclipse card, but kind of. I love that little sleeping squirrel stamp. Okay, so let's see what I can do with the 4 sentiments we have in this stamp set. You Got This seems like a good place to start. And that gives us our You Got This with our standing squirrel and that second largest pumpkin, and it moves. He's juggling that pumpkin around and around and around. Oh, this card makes me giggle. I stamped the squirrel. I just can't stop. I stamped the squirrel and the second largest pumpkin on Nina Solar white cardstock, colored them with my alcohol markers. I think my pumpkin coloring is a little better on this one. I die cut them with their matching dies. I'm pretty sure everybody's over my constant reliance on the Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle dies. So I actually bought a new Moda Scrap framed rectangles die set. I actually got this on sale. I think it was at scrapbook.com. There's only 4 dies in this set, but I love the casual feel of it and the funky cutout border on these dies. I die cut a panel of 100-pound Nina Solar white cardstock. We need some strength here to just under 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 with the second largest die in the set. I decided on an arrangement for the squirrel and the pumpkin, and then I stamped the sentiment in place and embossed it with clear embossing powder. I marked where the center of the pumpkin would fall on the die cut panel and used a Hero Arts Infinity Circle die to cut a hole through the panel. I took a double layer of foam tape and cut a circle from that, a little smaller than the hole, and I stuck that on the center back of the pumpkin. I die cut another circle larger than the hole from a scrap of white cardstock, then put the pumpkin foam tape through the die cut hole and glued the larger die cut circle on the back of the doubled foam tape, allowing the pumpkin to spin around without coming off. Once the pumpkin was in place, I glued the squirrel directly to the front panel. Now I added a single layer of foam tape around the die-cut panel inside of these border cuts and attached that to a 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 inch panel of terracotta cardstock from the kit. And then I glued that down to a white base. So here from the side, you can see there's a single panel of foam tape behind the background, but a double panel of foam tape at the pumpkin. And that gives that plenty of room to move around. This is a fun card to play with. Not only will the pumpkin spin around just by wiggling the card, but with the help of the pumpkin stem, it's greatly satisfying just to manually spin the pumpkin round and round. That's a big pumpkin for such a little squirrel. You got this. So most autumn-themed stamp set usually have some kind of a thankful sentiment included. This kit is no different. And we have our Thankful for You card with our little gray squirrel holding the heart. I stamped the stump, the squirrel, and the heart on 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, colored them all with my Oohoo alcohol markers, die cut them with their matching dies. I die cut a 2 3/4 inch by 4 inch panel of more Neenah cardstock with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I ink blended Hero Arts Splash Reactive ink on the top and Antique Linen Distress Oxide ink on the bottom. I decided on my arrangement, and I stamped and embossed the sentiment as usual. I added a thin white mat and a thin black mat behind the inked panel, and I glued those down to a white card base. I glued the stump flat to the card front, added the squirrel and the heart with thin pieces of foam tape. This is a lovely Thankful for You card. This would even work for a Valentine's Day card. Maybe you could say, I'm squirrely for you. Cute. I like the gray squirrel. Thankful for you. So it seems we're slowly making our way through all of the squirrels in this set, and I'm trying to use the accessories as well. And this gives us our fourth card. You're my favorite nut. This card displays a certain kind of nutty logic. So I stamped the group of nuts with VersaFine ink on a panel of Neenah cardstock 3 times. I cut a mask for the nuts just on the right and left sides so I could stamp the group of nuts again, left and right, and make a big enough pile of nuts for the squirrel to nestle into comfortably. I stamped the squirrel and 3 single nuts on more Neenah cardstock, colored everything with my Oohoo alcohol markers. Now I die cut the squirrel with its matching die, and I fussy cut the 3 nuts. I die cut the panel to 3 1/2 by 2 1/4 with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I ink blended a little bit of Antique Linen Distress Oxide ink on the edges. Now I did do some selective fussy cutting on the back side and the hands of the squirrel to get rid of the white borders where the die cut stamps intersects. You can see that there's his white border over there, but there's no white border down on the nuts, and it comes back over here, no white borders around his hands on that nut. I glued the squirrel and his nuts flat to the panel with 2 spots of thin foam tape behind his tail and behind his favorite nut. I dug out some fall-themed pattern papers from my stash and picked this fun polka dot for my background. I trimmed that to 5 inches by 3 3/4, added a thin black mat, and glued them to an A2 white card base. I created this sentiment using my Silhouette software and the Nanum pen script font. I printed that on a scrap of white cardstock and trimmed it to size with a Lawn Fawn Everyday Sentiment banners die. I added 2 layers of pitch black cardstock behind the sentiment and the assembled panel, and I glued them both to the card front. Now, I did consider a couple of different sentiments for this card. There are plenty of racy puns that would work, but I like this personalized approach a little better. You're my favorite nut. I'm sure all of us have one or two friends that this card would work perfectly for. So I was more than a little intrigued with this book stamp in this stamp set. Squirrel bibliophiles? Okay. There is what appears to be a sitting squirrel. I haven't used him yet. And that gives us our Notes from a Squirrel card. 1, plan ahead, stay active, spend time in the woods, go out on a limb, and it's okay to be a little nuts. I think those are some great notes from a squirrel we should all live by. This card makes me grin. I stamped the squirrel, the book, and the large mushroom on more Neenah cardstock, colored them with my Hoo-Hoo alcohol markers, die cut them with their matching dies. I played around with an arrangement, and I cut a scrap of white cardstock to 2 5/8 inches wide by 2 3/4 inches tall, and I stamped and colored the smaller mushroom before ink blending splash and antique linen on top and bottom. I added a thin black mat behind the inked panel. Now, I die cut this blue pattern paper from my stash to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I added a thin black mat and glued that to a white card base. Now, I created these notes using my Silhouette software and the Nanum pen font again. That is a great font for this stamp set. I printed the notes on a scrap of legal pad, and I punched the spiral bound edge with an old American Crafts punch, and I carefully tore the edges around the other 3 sides. Chewed. I glued the squirrel to the mushroom using a little fussy cutting on his butt and the right side of the mushroom to hide the die-cut white borders. You can see the white borders end right there. There's no border on his butt, no border on the right side of the mushroom, but it starts again at the bottom. I like that his leg is on the front of the mushroom, but his tail is behind. I glued the book in the squirrel's hand. I didn't bother with the white borders on that, and I glued the assemblage flat on the inked panel. Now, the smaller mushroom becomes a toadstool footstool. I'm sorry, you're going to have to forgive me. I glued the completed panel to the card front and added the sentiment using a tape runner, no liquid glue on thin paper. I do think this advice is pretty sound, especially coming from a squirrel, and I really like that 4th note, go out on a limb. Notes from a squirrel. So I guess these 5 squirrels all deserved their own cards. Let's turn our attention to the Treehouse die set, and that gives us a Would You Be Mine card. And here we have an honest-to-goodness pun. I couldn't resist die cutting this tree from wood abachi solid cardstock. Now that came from the My Monthly Hero September 2019 kit. This might just be about the last bit that I have of that cardstock. I love the texture on the cardstock. It's great for a tree, and it's no effort. I die cut the carvings into the tree trunk and blended a little antique linen on the edges and a touch down the center of the tree just for a little variation in the colors of that trunk. Now, I wanted a bunch of leaves on top of this tree, but I wasn't looking forward to having to color every leaf, so I die cut the maple leaf die from the kit from beeswax, saffron, and Tuscan cardstocks from the kit. I did ink blend some antique linen distress oxide ink on all of the cardstock pieces before die cutting the leaves, just for a little color variation. I added some veining to the otherwise plain die cut leaves with a pink Pigma Micron pen, That gives us a nice touch of added color and detail without me having to color all 18 leaves. I ink blended Hero Art's Splash Reactive ink on the sides of an A2 white card base, so it's directly on the card base, and glued the tree trunk on top. I arranged the leaves and glued everything flat to the card front. I did try to hide the stems of all the leaves as they were attached, because we don't really have any branches up here, you know. I printed this sentiment, same as the rest. This is, again, that Nanum pen script font on a scrap of white cardstock, and I trimmed it to size with a Lawn Fawn die and swiped over it with a little antique linen ink. I highlighted the heart carving using a disposable micro applicator and the antique linen ink. And I also went over the die cut lettering with an 03 Pigma Micron pen to darken it up as much as possible. You can see it really good there. You plus me, I heart you. Another Valentine in this fall kit with a pun. Would you be mine? So this is a quote-unquote treehouse die set, and there is an oval die for the squirrel's home inside of the tree. Okay, I swear, if any creature opened up a hole this large in a tree, it would surely kill the tree. Nevertheless, that gives us our hello card. Ding dong. I die cut the tree from Nina cardstock along with the house hole. I stamped the standing squirrel and colored both with my Ohuhu alcohol markers. I did fussy cut this squirrel out. On another panel of Nina cardstock, I placed the tree in position and outlined where the house hole fell. I removed the tree and I stamped the two squirrels inside the house and colored all with my Ohuhu alcohol markers. I ink blended the Splash Reactive ink on the sides of the panel before trimming it to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches and adding a thin black mat behind. I glued the inked panel and mat to a white card base, and I stamped the sentiment using Hero Art's unicorn white ink and embossed that with white embossing powder. I added 2 layers of pitch black cardstock behind the tree for some homey depth that makes our opening a little bit further away from our squirrels, and I arranged our visiting squirrel on the branch. Since he was fussy cut, it was easy to split his arms and legs so it looks like he's actually holding on to the tree. For a final touch, I die cut some translucent leaf notes. Now, these are from the My Monthly Hero September 2018 card kit. I die cut some of those with one of the leaf dies in this kit, and then I added those to the card front for some extra color and shine. Now, maybe that house hole is so large because this is just a dead tree stump. The lack of branches might support that theory. Hello, ding dong, squirrel calling, squirrel! So I knew I was going to have to buckle down and color me some leaves before I was done with this card kit. And that gives us our Fall is My Favorite Color card. I did switch to my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers to color the leaves. I do prefer my Zig markers for coloring such small pieces. Now, on a panel of Bristol Smooth cardstock, I stamped the smallest pumpkin along with a mask using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I fussy cut the left side of the mask, placed that over the small pumpkin, and then I stamped the next larger pumpkin next to that, removed and had my pumpkins sitting one in front of the other. I stamped the leaves randomly across the rest of the panel and stamped a few extra leaves on some scrap Bristol Smooth cardstock and colored everything with my Zig markers. I die cut that panel to 3.5 by 2 1/4 inches with the Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I used my Pebbles chalk palette around the leaves to tone down the white a little bit. That helps, brings it more in line with the background. Now, I had this breezy background paper in my stash. The dotted swirls are actually gold with just a little touch of shine. I die cut the pattern paper with a 5" by 3 3/4" lawn fawn stitched rectangle die, added a thin black mat, glued those to a white card base. I stamped the sentiment on a scrap of matching cardstock and embossed it with clear embossing powder. I cut it to size and added a thin black mat behind that as well. Now, I fussy cut the extra leaves. I almost always color the edges of my fussy cuts with a black memento marker, and I added a thin black mat to the colored panel. I glued the sentiment and colored panel directly to the card front and added 2 of the individual leaves, breaking through the boundaries of the panel with thin foam tape. For the final touch, I added a number of the sunset enamel dots for more texture and shine. I personally have always felt very comfortable in fall colors. Fall is my favorite color. So I was determined to figure out another way to use this treehouse die, since the only branches on this die end in abrupt cutoffs. Those are actually the edges of an A2 card. This presents a bit of a challenge, but I really like this idea. And we have a hang in there card. So I die cut the tree from more Nina's Solar White cardstock, and I cut it right down the center so I could move the flat cut edges to the sides with the branches in the middle. Now on the die, the top branch is short and stubby. So I die cut another of the longer branch. I flipped it upside down and melded that with the short branch to make it longer. That's some change up for you. I colored both trees with the hoo-hoo markers. I die cut a piece of Hero Art's Arctic cardstock to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with the lawn fawn stitched rectangle die. I ink blended Hero Art's splash reactive ink down the center. So we've got a nice little ombre of blue down the center of our trees. I taped the 2 trees in place on that panel and cut off the overlaps along the top edge, including that new longer branch. Now, since this leaf was the main focal point, I wanted one that was a little larger than the leaves in the kit. I found this leaf in the My Monthly Hero September of 2018 kit, where, there it is, right there. That's the stamp right there. It's a little bigger. I stamped that on Bristol Smooth cardstock with VersaFine Onyx black ink. I colored it with my Zig markers and I fussy cut it out. I printed the sentiment on my inked background panel, just like all the rest of them. Again, the Nanum Pen script font. And I added a thin black mat and then glued those to a white card base. I glued the trees flat to the card front and added the leaf with a little foam tape. I really like this encouragement card. Splitting the tree in 2 and moving them to the sides almost makes this like a 3-panel card front. The blues and browns work well together. The leaf is just the right size with enough detail to really pop. I love it. Hang in there. So that September 2023 My Monthly Hero card kit, I used the Happy Autumn from that card kit for this card, and I really liked these big autumnal greetings. So I decided I'd use one of those greetings for my last card, and that gives us our Autumn Greetings card with that sleeping squirrel again. So I stamped the sentiment on a piece of pattern paper from my stash. I embossed it with clear embossing powder. Look at that shine. I colored the little leaves and the mushroom with alcohol markers, and I added a little drop shadow behind the sentiment. I do believe this sleeping squirrel is my favorite squirrel in this set. I stamped, colored, and fussy cut him just like all the other squirrels. I die cut that stamped panel with a Hero Arts oval infinity die, and I die cut the next larger oval from black cardstock and glued them together. I wrapped the brown twine from our kit around and around and around the bottom of the squirrel to create a little messy nest for his comfort. I used a thick piece of foam tape for the top of the squirrel and glue for the nest, and I placed the squirrel right on top of that sentiment. Now this background is a piece of watercolor paper perforated with a Honeybee Stamps Spring Leaves Pierced cover plate. I love that, works really nice. Spring, bah, it works just as well for the autumn. I trimmed that to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I ink blended antique linen ink over the whole background and added a thin black mat and glued those to a white card base. I glued the oval down to the card front and added a few sunset enamel dots for some extra shine. Looks like a perfectly cozy nest for napping. And there you have all 10 of my cards inspired by the Hero Studio Card Kit of the Month for September of 2025. I have to admit, these squirrels are pretty cute. And I do love the overall palette created with this batch of cards. Now, I'm usually pretty slavish over trying to use every single stamp in a stamp set, but I relaxed a bit this month. I guess I didn't use the rake or the coffee cup or the banner of leaves. I thought I was doing good just figuring out how to use the book in this set. But for a fall-themed kit, we have a pretty diverse group of cards here. There are a few outright autumn cards, but we also have some possible Valentines and encouragement cards and friendship cards. We've got a pun, even a moving interactive card. Let me know which cards are your favorite. As usual, if you'd like to get this kit for yourself, you need to subscribe to the Hero Studio Card Kit of the Month by September 27th. If you do go shopping at Hero Arts, please use my links in the description down below. I make a small commission from whatever you buy at no cost to you, and that helps support this page and keeps a little inspiration coming your way. Thank you so very, very much for sharing your time with me today. Your attention means the world to me. If you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up at the top of this post. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please click that subscribe button, click the bell so you're notified every time I post a new video. Please take a few moments to like me, list me, pin me, post me, share me with all of your crafty friends. And remember, don't run with scissors. As always, I send you and yours love and light, and Squirrel, happy crafting. For more detailed information, better pictures, and product links, please visit my website at cardcutups.com.